5 years after a pivot toward Asia, what is President Obama's legacy in the region? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C., and this is The Heat. With a high-profile state visit and glamorous state dinner, Chinese President Xi Jinping and U.S. President Barack Obama reinforced the importance of China-U.S. relations last autumn. President Obama sought to be America's first so-called Pacific president, increasing the role of the U.S. in the Asia-Pacific region. For more on the legacy of U.S. President Obama's Asia rebalancing, we're joined now by CCTV's White House correspondent, Jessica Stone. And Jessica, why did the U.S. president turn towards Asia, and how did it impact U.S. foreign policy?
Well, the president just landed here behind me. You may still hear the helicopter on it, but there's really three main reasons, and they did follow with U.S. foreign policy. They saw a tremendous economic potential in the Asia-Pacific. You know, it accounts for at least 40% of global GDP, and it's a tremendous fast-growing market that the U.S. simply thought it should have more access to. They also wanted to balance the rise of China, and so that has elicited more economic and diplomatic engagement in regional meetings like APEC, the East Asia Summit, ASEAN. Many of these meetings now have U.S. representatives, if not the U.S. president, at play there. And they also wanted to turn away from a legacy of military spending in the Middle East, which was largely arbitrated by George W. Bush, the previous president. And we saw so much money being poured into the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. The next U.S. president, President Obama, wanted to invest in the military buildup in the Asia-Pacific, sending 2,500 U.S. troops to Darwin, Australia, increasing basing agreements and re-signing a basing agreement with the Philippines, also having freedom of navigation patrols more regularly in the South China Sea, and having more access to ports in places like Singapore. So all of this followed, but you know, I mentioned the access to the markets. The biggest economic part of this pivot is, of course, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Agreement, which has yet to be ratified by the United States, and which is really a key part of the economic portion of this pivot. On it.
Right, so Jessica, this rebalance towards Asia, it focused on all U.S. relations with Asian nations. How was it received in the region?
Well, certainly U.S. allies received it very well. You know, they got a lot more support for their positions. Take the Philippines, for example, in its court filing against China with respect to island building in the South China Sea. The U.S. supported the Philippines in that court proceeding. But certainly Beijing has been no fan of this pivot. It has seen it as an act of aggression in its backyard, an act of assertiveness, and it's really begun to make it much more of adversarial parts of the relationship with respect to the pivot. And, you know, we see this in just the words of the Chinese ambassador to the United States. This past May, he was very clear in drawing the lines between China's reaction to the pivot and the pivot itself, holding the pivot responsible for China's behavior in the region.
Tensions started to rise about 5 or 6 years ago. About the same time when we began to hear about the so-called pivoting to Asia. So in the last few years, disputes intensified, relations strained, confidence weakened.
And Beijing arguing that it doesn't want to see an escalation of military tensions, certainly in the region, and laying it at the feet of Washington for sort of starting that process. Now, one note about the legacy with respect to the economic portion. Much of Obama's legacy with respect to the pivot is going to be measured in the success of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Agreement. As I said, it has not been ratified by Washington. The politics are not on the side any longer of that agreement in the United States, with an incoming president in just a few weeks now. And certainly the White House is pushing hard for it. But if it does not pass in Washington, it is going to benefit Beijing, because many of those same economies that are part of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Agreement are also negotiating with Beijing and with Delhi in a bigger trade agreement that is also on track to be completed in the next few months. And if they don't trade with the United States, they'll be trading with Beijing.
Thanks, Jessica. That's CCTV's Jessica Stone reporting from the White House. Well, joining us now from Beijing, Victor Gao is a Chinese international relations expert. From Manila, Richard Heydarian is a geopolitical analyst and professor at De La Salle University. And with us in the studio, Becker is executive director of the Answer Coalition and author of Imperialism in the 21st Century. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Victor, let me start with you. For President Obama, the relationship with China started with good intentions. He said in November 2009 that he was not seeking to contain China and that Beijing was central to Washington's global agenda. Now, as his presidency draws to a close, what's your assessment?
I would say over the past 7 to 8 years, China-U.S. relations, despite many hiccups and ups and downs, have been, generally speaking, well handled, and there is greater stability. And despite of all the confrontations sometimes flaring up, both Beijing and Washington have been able to manage the relations with great sanity. Having said that, I think from Beijing's perspective, we need to listen to what the United States has to say, but more importantly, we need to watch what they need to walk. And in this respect, I think in more recent years, there have been a series of provocations from the United States, and the pivot to Asia strategy by the United States is perceived by China as a confrontational way aimed at containing China's peaceful rise. Now, philosophically speaking, any attempt to contain China, the largest population in the world, the largest economy in the world by purchasing power parity, and the second largest economy by official exchange rate as the benchmark, will be futile. Between China and the United States, the better way is to deal with each other with respect and coordinate their actions together despite their differences, rather than one country trying to contain the other side or to derail the peaceful development of the other side.
Brian, what is your view on the pivot to Asia? As Victor pointed out, there is a perception in China that the pivot is an attempt to contain China and put the brakes on a rising power. Is there much credence to that?
Absolutely. By 2020, 60%, perhaps more, maybe 65%, of the U.S. naval and Air Force assets will be now deployed into the Asia Pacific. We see the United States using the so-called threat posed by North Korea's nuclear missile test, which could be handled in other ways, such as negotiations, as a pretext to deploy THAAD, which is not really directed against North Korea, but THAAD in South Korea will be perceived in China and in Russia as a way for the United States to gain military supremacy, not just in the Pacific, but possibly in outer space. We have really the irony that President Obama said this is the dynamic, growing part of the world. 50% of the world's people, 40% of the world's GDP. We have to be there. The United States had obviously been not just spending money in the Middle East, had it been bogged down by the feckless and reckless adventure in the Iraq invasion. The United States was sort of stuck in the Middle East. Meanwhile, China was rising. Other countries were rising economically. And of course, in this central part of the world, the United States was having to play catch up. So President Obama never clearly defined what the Asia pivot was. Was it maritime? Was it trade? Was it security? Was it non-proliferation? It was all of those things. But here we are, 5 years later, Trans-Pacific Partnership isn't going to pass. In terms of maritime, Philippines is realigning its position away from the United States and with China. And in terms of nuclear non-proliferation, even the United States top officials like James Clapper are now recognizing that it's a lost cause to denuclearize North Korea, and there has to be a different approach. So I would say in net, President Obama's pivot to Asia, the rebalance has been pretty much of a disaster.
Richard, what is your view? You know, as Brian points out, that the pivot to Asia was meant to be a lot of things. It was meant to be about reinforcing existing security alliances, about deepening relationships, about expanding trade. It was also about expanding the U.S. military footprint in that part of the world. Lofty ideals, but not much content, is there?
Well, without a question, I think President Obama's decision to announce the rebalancing of China wants to get out of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. We're not going in a positive direction, and he promised during his campaign that he wanted to get America out of those wars. At the same time, it was a recognition, as your reporter and previous speakers have suggested, that Asia is the future. This is the new global center of gravity when it comes to economics and trade. And if the United States wanted to extricate itself out of the global financial crisis, it had to increase its market access to booming economies of Asia, from China to Japan and Philippines to Indonesia. So, but the thing is this, as far as the pivot is concerned, it has not been uniform in terms of its implementation and vigor. And at the same time, of course, it is multidimensional, meaning in certain dimensions, probably more successful than the others. It has not been uniform.
Hi, Richard. We're having problems hearing you. I'm sorry, we're having problems with your audio. We're going to try and fix that. But in the meantime, let me move on to Victor Gao. Victor, a big difference between words and deeds from the United States. Let's take a listen to what President Obama had to say about the U.S.-China relationship. Let's watch.
The United States welcomes the rise of a China that is peaceful, stable, prosperous, and a responsible player in global affairs. And I'm committed to expanding our cooperation, even as we address disagreements candidly and constructively.
Do you believe that to be the case? Do you believe that the United States welcomes a growing and powerful China?
Well, in China, there is tremendous amount of goodwill towards the American people and towards the United States as a country in general. However, we are very much concerned that while President Obama has been saying one set of words, look at what the Secretary of Defense Ashton Carter has been doing, and some of the generals in the Pacific Fleet and other units of the United Armed Forces have been doing over the past several years. They declare that war between China and the United States may happen tonight. They declare that the United States need to arm to the teeth to fight a war against China. Now, there is no alarm in China, of course, about that, because we philosophically believe that a war between China and the United States is impossible, because that will be destroying mankind as a whole. However, we do need to pay attention to these very dangerous expressions. Ashton Carter should not run the foreign policy of the United States. He should listen to what President Obama needs to say, and he should act under the supervision and the direction of the Commander-in-Chief. But we see a lot of confusion coming out of Washington, coming out of the Pacific Fleet, etc. And if the United States really wants to push China's development back and derail China's peaceful rise by pivoting to Asia in the real sense of the word, then don't be alarmed, at least according to some academic studies here in China and elsewhere, that the Chinese fleet may sail to California and to the Gulf of Mexico or offshore in Virginia. And if that happens, don't be alarmed and don't criticize China or lose your sanity about what the Chinese military can do. Between China and the United States, I always emphasize the better way is not to threaten each other, but to really treat each other with respect. China, given its size, given its system, given its long continuous history, will not kowtow to any superpower in the world. The United States needs to change its mentality and the way of doing business with China by respecting China as an equal, rather than believing that China can be pushed and elbowed out of its way if the United States adopt the position of shooting from the hips.
Brian, we're told one of the reasons for the pivot to Asia was the president's desire to refocus foreign policy in the United States away from Europe and the Middle East, traditional areas where the U.S. has been focusing its foreign policy, away from there to Asia. Why? Why the shift?
Well, I think the United States had shifted to Asia before. There was an Asia pivot that took place in 1899 under William McKinley. That was the invasion of the Philippines. Maybe 1 million Filipinos died. The U.S. took the Philippines, a former Spanish colony, and made it an American colony and used that as a bridgehead to enter China. It had been a latecomer to the colonial investment or colonial division of China by European powers. There was a second pivot to Asia, and that was right after World War II. The U.S. fought 2 ground wars in Asia, the Korean War and the Vietnam War. In other words, the United States has been trying to dominate Asia in one way or another throughout the 20th century. And I think what happened during the Bush administration, the George W. Bush, is that the again, reckless adventure into Iraq that bogged down hundreds of thousands of U.S. troops in a war that could not be won, but devoured huge amounts of the national treasury. The United States government under Obama then realized the United States was losing pace in Asia. Again, the most dynamic, the most important, the most exponentially growing part of the world economy, 50% of the world's population. So there was this frantic, I would call it a frantic effort to get back on top in Asia. But again, here's the problem with the United States. When it pivots anywhere, it starts to pivot with the military. The world's people don't want to be intimidated by the military. They're not going to be. The U.S. always leads with the military. What does that do? That makes China want to come back at the United States. It says to China, look, we have a perceived threat, a real threat. This is the greatest military power in the world. They're deploying 60% of their air and naval assets into our area. Like as Victor said, if China did that along the east coast of the American, on the American east coast, America would say, hey, that's a threat. We perceive that as a threat, so China has to take countermeasures. The people in the Philippines who have a long, proud tradition of wanting to be independent and free of the United States, we now see what's happening. When the U.S. tried to set up a confrontation at The Hague between the Philippines and China over the South China Sea, China says, well, Hague doesn't have sovereignty over China's territory. We do. And the Philippines now under Duterte say, hey, we're going to be friends with China. We're not going to be anybody's puppet. Those are his words.
Okay, we're going to have to take a break right now. Coming up, how will the next U.S. president handle relations with Asia? Our panel gives us their views on that. You're on The Heat. Stay with us.